So, last class we began with the Scientific Revolution and Enlightenment, Part 2. Last class we started off by looking at what I refer to as a modern way of thinking. The use of rationality only, not referring to religion as an answer to complex problems. Believing in experimentation, trying everything to see if the answer actually holds up under rigorous scrutiny. And a demand for intellectual freedom to see if your answers to those particular questions that you're asking are correct. Now, for last class, the only thing we looked at was scientists who were asking questions about the relationship between the sun and the earth. Newton said the theory that the earth is the center of the universe, which has been accepted by scholars for hundreds of years, accepted by the church because it makes sense in the Christian worldview that God created the earth and the humans and the animals, and of course the earth is at the center of the universe. That theory, Copernicus said, is simply incorrect. It makes no scientific, mathematical sense. This challenge to religious authority in the realm of science expanded with Galileo and Newton, who eventually proved that there is a scientific explanation for the workings of nature and humans if given the freedom to pursue knowledge wherever it takes them, can figure out how the world works. Now, if they can do that with nature, what would humans achieve if given the intellectual freedom to explore the best system of politics, or organized religion, economics, or criminal justice, which produces the most benefits for the most people and causes the least hardship? Well, up until the 1600s, nobody was willing to ask these questions because you were going against authority, religious, state, social authority. But the scientific revolution showed if you ask questions, the worst thing that you're going to come up with is a wrong answer. But if you just keep pushing, you'll get the right answer. And if it upsets a few people along the way, so what? As long as you improve people's lives here on Earth right now. This pushed us into the Enlightenment, where questions were now being asked about everything else, like up here. And the guy, and the Enlightenment as a pure definition is taking that rational worldview and saying, how do we fix society? Is absolutism truly the best form of government? Let's look at the pros and cons. Mercantilism, where the state controls every aspect of the economy. Is that a good idea? Let's look at the pros and the cons. Who benefits, who suffers? Organized religion that imposes one faith on an entire people and country. What are the pros and cons of that? And the alliance of the church and the state. Let's look at today, who benefits, who suffers, and let's look historically. Finally, criminal justice. How do we punish criminals today? How have we done it in the past? Has it allowed us to reach our goals of reforming, preserving our society? Or has it caused more problems? Let's ask those tough questions, and let's improve the world that we live in now. Now remember, this is pretty revolutionary. Because in the Christian worldview, up until this point, the way you're born is just the way it is. Don't ask too many questions, because whatever works, works. And if you were born poor and suffering, well, that's just dumb luck. But listen to the church, and when you die, you go to heaven. And everyone's equal, and everyone benefits in heaven. Starting in the 1700s, people got impatient. If we could fix life now, not in heaven, but now, why wouldn't we? If we could make food cheaper, clothing less expensive, Cure diseases? Why wouldn't we? What's stopping us? The fear of allowing that type of intellectual freedom. Well, screw it. Let's do it anyway. So, the guys that were doing all of this tough question asking were known as the philosophes, French for philosophers. These folks mostly lived in the France of the absolutist France that we already looked at in this class, where there was no intellectual freedom under Louis XIV. But under his son and grandson, who were not as powerful a king as Louis XIV, stuff started to seep through. And these philosophers recognized once you publish your ideas, you might get in trouble. You might have to flee the country, but the ideas are out there. And yes, some of the books can be burned, but not all the books. And once the ideas are out there, they take on a life of their own, and then people start talking. And you change the way people think. Remember Galileo, published his findings, got in trouble, was forced to say I was wrong, didn't matter. Books were already out there. And people like Isaac Newton built on his ideas and then proved that he was right. And then 400 years later, the Catholic Church formally apologizes to Galileo, which was kind of remarkable because the Church doesn't really admit that it's wrong, ever. John Locke. Remember, we finished with him. The guy who took all of this rational thinking in the scientific revolution and said, let's turn it into philosophy. Let's ask questions about everything, and let's see if the answers work or don't. If they don't, throw it out. Remember, this was the guy who argued for the separation of church and state, because if you don't, you just end up punishing a lot of people because they don't believe in the God you want them to believe in, but you can't force people to believe in anything. That's not real faith. This was also the guy that argued that you are not born with original sin, which is what Catholics believe and what baptism is used to absolve you. You are born with a blank slate, and so society makes you. If you are born with a blank slate, there is less and less need for the rigid control of the church and the state. There is more room for freedom, for personal choice, to become smart, less interesting, evil, good, charitable, etc. The most revolutionary thing that John Locke produced was the book Two Treatises on Government. This guy was incredibly prolific. In the year 1688, 89, 90, he produced the Two Treatises on Government, which are huge books on government and how they're supposed to work. He produced that letter concerning toleration that you read for me, and another shorter letter concerning understanding, the whole blank slate thing. Remember, and all of this work came out during the Glorious Revolution in England, where the king was overthrown by Parliament, representing the people. Because the king wanted to be an absolutist monarch, and the Parliament said, no, in England we will have checks and balances. A Parliament elected by the people. So, John Locke justified the Glorious Revolution, that the people have a right to rebel, in this book, Two Treatises on Government. And his argument was very simple. Because remember, Bossuet, he argued people do not have the right to challenge their king. Look at the Bible. The Bible says God gave kings authority over his subjects. How does John Locke argue against that? Because he's arguing for a totally different worldview of what government is, where it comes from, and what's it responsible for. John Locke goes back in history, and he suggests this. Let's go back before we had laws, before we had civilization, writing, cities. Let's go way back to the beginning, where all you had were the first humans, living on their own, out in the deserts of Africa, Mesopotamia, whatever. This is way before you had language, laws, anything. What do these people have? What are they born with? And he argues, well, they have their life, they have their freedom, because there's nothing around. There's no prisons, there's no laws, there's no taxes, there's nothing. And whatever they make or acquire, they have their property. Those three things are their natural rights. Life, liberty, property. Not given to them by anybody. You are born with them or you acquire them. Follow me so far? Life, liberty, property. So then he said, how did all these individuals eventually form a government? Laws. Why did they do it? And his argument was simple. All of these individuals, by themselves, are weak. All of us in this room, according to John Locke, would have our life, our liberty, and the enjoyment of our property. Those would be our natural rights. But some of us are stronger than others and could take from others their life, their liberty, and their property. So how do you avoid this situation where might makes right? John Locke argues people voluntarily, let's say you and I, come together and say, we will give up a little bit of our freedom by collectively forming a government, writing the laws that will protect us. And if one of us breaks that law, the rest of us will punish that person. You follow me? Jay, is that a yes or a no? Okay. So we voluntarily enter a system where we give up our complete freedom, but we get in return collective security, right? But this is the trick. Locke argues, if at the beginning of time humans voluntarily entered government to protect their natural rights, that means government exists to serve the people. And the moment that government stops serving the people have the right to overthrow their government, just like it happened in England in 1688 at the Glorious Revolution. In Bossuet's political treatise, the people do not have a right to overthrow even a corrupt and evil king. In John Locke's political treatise, the people do have that right. It's two different ways of looking at the origins of government. It all depends on what argument you're trying to make. If you're an absolutist king, you're going to follow Bossuet. If you are interested in checks and balances, you're going to follow Locke. And I think we all know how the world turned out. Most people follow John Locke. Because what happens when you give absolute power to one individual or group? Corruption. Exploitation. Right? So, and obviously we adopted this idea, and thus the American Revolution. Other people started asking some questions about politics. And now it's the beginning of the long line of French philosophers. The Baron de Montesquieu. I love this picture because there was a fashion at the time for people to depict themselves like ancient Roman writers and philosophers, like it gave them extra legitimacy. Montesquieu looked at politics more deeply, and he said, we are taught that the only system of government that anybody should have is absolutism, and it's based on the Bible. But I think that's crap. Because I think that system of government might work for some societies, but other societies, it's completely useless. It causes more harm than good. So Montesquieu does what all researchers do. Go ahead.
Do you believe it's crap, or do you believe?
I'm talking for Montesquieu. I hope I'll be more clear when I think things are crap. And maybe I will. Montesquieu would argue, what Montesquieu did was he looked at his history books And he said, let's look at all the systems of government throughout all of history that we have records for, and let's see which ones were successful and why, and which one were unsuccessful and why. And he came up with 3 examples: republics, constitutional monarchies, despotism. What's a republic? A republic is any government with no king. The people have the power. Now, there are democratic republics where the people directly, you and I, each individually have a vote, and we have a direct say in the making of laws. And he says, that's a good system of government if it's a small country, everybody more or less has the same wealth and is thinking along the same lines, and everyone more or less has the same level of education. For instance, Holland. That works pretty good. Or ancient Athens, Greece. There are aristocratic republics where the nobles are representatives of the people, but they can't become corrupt because there's a bunch of laws that protect the people's rights. Again, republics in general only work in small countries, small populations, with people who have more or less the same wealth and more or less the same level of education. There's no actual differences there that government has to work out. There aren't that many republics in existence in the 1700s that Montesquieu could point to, because most territories are large. There is a huge gap between rich and poor, and you need a strong central government. So, for that, he says, constitutional monarchies are the best. Like England. England's constitutional monarchy is the best form of government for big territories with lots of people that have many, many differences that have to be all brought together in some fashion. A strong central government. But to give that much power to government, you need to have checks and balances like the English have. They have a strong king, but then they also have a parliament that makes the laws and is the checks and the balance to the king. They also have an independent court system. All very good. Strong government, oversees a large territory with many, many differences of religion and wealth and ideas, but the power doesn't become corrupt because there's checks and balances. Finally, there is despotism, which is a nasty sounding word on purpose, where you have one person in charge of everything, and in this way, all the power is centered in one place, and he's not crazy about despotism. Despotism to him is what absolute monarchy is. Strong central government, no checks and balances, which leads to corruption. But he does say despotism is good for some societies. What he considers uncivilized societies. Africa, Asia, South America, etc. He says in those quote-unquote uncivilized societies, where the people don't have enough education to get involved in the debates of parliament and so on and so forth, they need a strong hand. There is no room for intellectual discussion in those societies. You need a strong king to bring order. Now, the reason I bring this up is because Montesquieu was obviously an enemy of absolute government in Europe, considered a superior civilization. But he was more than happy with absolutism or despotism, the same thing, for what he considered to be uncivilized people. And the reason I bring this up is because even these guys that were convinced of the need for equality and social reform and limited government were still white Christian Europeans who considered everybody else substandard, inferior. It's the same thinking which within 100 years would lead to the colonization of all of Africa, chunks of Asia, and the extermination of most native peoples in the New World. Even with these guys. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Rousseau is an interesting guy. He also wrote about politics, but Rousseau was a Democrat, meaning he wanted a government that most closely represented the interests of the people without any go-between. Rousseau's an interesting guy. He was very popular. The women loved him, and he had a number of illegitimate children. He just ran around and then left the women that he got pregnant. He was sort of like a rock star for the time, with all the irresponsibility of rock stars. Now, what did he want? He wanted a government that protected the rights of the people, that was run by the people, but he went further. He wanted a government that protected people's virtue. Now it gets a bit more complicated. So he wants a government that protects your rights, but also protects your soul. A government that actually regulates what is allowed and not allowed for your own benefit. See, now things are getting a little complicated. John Locke's ideal system of government is the government keeps its hands off and leaves as much freedom to the people as possible. Right? Rousseau is saying, well, if you give everybody freedom, that's wonderful. No one is being oppressed. But then you have all these individuals running around making their own decisions. Who's thinking of the common good? Who's thinking about the common good? Well, the state has to. So how do they determine what's good for all people? By still protecting the rights of the people and not just simply imposing things on them. Well, that's where it gets complicated, right? So, he is known for a couple of major publications. A discourse on the origin of inequality in 1755. This was a revolutionary book because he argued, at a time when Europe was becoming incredibly wealthy from the agricultural and industrial revolution, the middle class was expanding, the poor were rising themselves up out of poverty, moving to the cities, working, saving money, etc., etc. He argued at a time of greatly increasing wealth in Europe that wealth is at the root of all human suffering, specifically private property. So 100 years before Karl Marx came forward with the ideology of communism that said private property must be abolished to end the suffering of poor people, that all property must be owned in common, Rousseau was saying, the moment we invented private property, some people had more, some people had less. Most people had less. Get rid of private property, you get rid of inequality, you get rid of suffering. Ernest. Everything. Actual property you can hold or wealth. No private property. I know it's foreign to us in this country because we're based on it, but that was the thinking back then. Back then, if you lived in the countryside before they invented land enclosure and private property, there was such thing as common land. Whoever went to a field that wasn't being used by somebody else, you can plant your crops. And people would respect that first come, first serve, because it's common land. There's no more common land left over. Even the parks and the forests, they're owned by somebody, the state, an individual. Now, Rousseau's big contribution was this, The Social Contract, the book, published in 1762. This book argued that we need to find a way to bring together equality and virtue in political theory. How do we protect people's individual rights, but also make them better people? So the government has to rule in the interests of the people, tell them what to do to make them better. But how do you do that without becoming corrupt, without imposing stupid ideas on the people? And his solution was this: the general will. What is the will of the general public? And that is the only way a law should be made. Okay, great. How do you measure the general will? You fully educate the people about all sides of an issue, then they vote. Fantastic. So what is a win? Is it 75% say yes? Is it 51%? Is it 50.1%? And even if you have 85% say yes to a particular issue, what do you do with the remaining 15? Well, according to Rousseau, you have to force them to be free. What does that mean? It means by living in a society of laws, you have freedom. If you choose not to obey those laws, you have to be forced to do so. Otherwise, we'll kick you out and then, see how you fare out there by yourself without our protection. But if you stay here, you enjoy the freedom of our system of government and laws. It gets a little tricky, though. Because what if that 15% is saying no to not just raising taxes, but placing all people of a particular race or religion behind walls in a ghetto, a neighborhood? What if you're voting on taking the rights away from certain groups of people? Plus, what if the general will is simply wrong, but people haven't come to realize that? Slavery, genocide, tax policies, these all things change over time. The reason why people like the social contract is because it really kind of explains how we got into much of our mess nowadays. Every single 20th century dictator, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Benito Mussolini, Fidel Castro, Ho Chi Minh, every single modern day dictator who has acted like an absolutist monarch but never really ever refers to religion, they say that they have a right to do what they want because they represent the will of the people. Even if the people don't want it, they say, I know what's good for the people. Like a parent, which can obviously lead to a certain amount of exploitation, right? Voltaire, an interesting cat. Voltaire was rather famous. He wrote about religion. Voltaire was the kind of guy that everyone knew who he was. Monarchs wanted him to come visit them in their palaces and act as their private counselor. He was incredibly popular. And there is a theory that I have heard, and I've said this before. He was so popular and everybody knew where he was every moment of the time that if you wrote a letter and put it in an envelope and simply put his name on it, eventually the letter would make its way to wherever Voltaire was staying, because everybody knew where he was. Which is problematic because he was often in trouble with the government for publishing things that got him in trouble. He was a Frenchman, but he oftentimes ran across the border into Switzerland when the government got fed up with what he was writing. And what did he write? He wrote a bunch of things, like short stories, named Candide, 1759. It was a short story, fiction, and the whole point of the story was to say that religion is basically superstition. It's all made-up fantasy land. Now, he wasn't saying God is made up. He's saying organized religion, the idea that human beings know the will of God and how to worship Him. How do you know? How do you know that Catholics are wrong and Protestants are right? Or the Muslims are wrong, or the Jews, or how do you know? How do you know that you have the one true way of worshiping God? How do you know? You don't know. And if you don't know, then what right do you have to punish other people of a different faith? It makes no sense whatsoever to do that. So, look at the progression here. John Locke was saying, just separate church and state. Voltaire builds on Locke and he says, you know what? Most organized religions argue it's either our way or we'll kill you. And what has that led to? Civil war, international war, genocide. So organized religion is a problem. Not faith, not God, but the humans that interpret the will of God and establish all those rules. So for him, just like many philosophers, the only truly safe way of worshiping God is what's known as deism. De is just Latin for God. Deism. But what does that mean? It means you believe there is a God, and you see his or her workings in nature around you, but you can't possibly think that you yourself understand his or her workings. And as such, you have no right to start punishing others who don't believe the same way you do. Deism argues there is a God, you see their workings in nature, but he does not interfere in the daily life of humans. He created everything, hit the on switch, sat back and said, let's see how this turns out. Why? Remember John Locke that said everyone is born with a blank slate? Humans have freedom of choice, and the whole scientific revolution was about humans given freedom of choice don't destroy themselves, they improve the condition of the world. That's what deism is all about. God created everything, gave humans freedom of choice, and said, let's see what you do with this. In this fashion, it is okay to allow all religions to exist, because they all believe in a God, and how you choose to worship is your own business. It's not anybody else's business. It's certainly no reason to kill anybody over it. Remember, none of these guys are atheists. They all believe in a God. They just think the way humans have chosen to interpret how to worship God has led to more trouble than it's worth. Yeah. What, deism? It's a system of thought. Adam Smith brings us to economics. Again, side view, wig, black and white etching. Adam Smith is known for one major publication, The Wealth of Nations, published in 1776, the same year as our Declaration of Independence. Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations is very simple. All those other guys are arguing that people have the freedom to make choices, and if given that freedom, they will make the right choices. Freedom to choose the proper system of government, freedom to choose whatever faith they want. So what's wrong with the economy? At this time, the most popular form of economic system is mercantilism, the stuff from Louis XIV, where the government controls every aspect of the economy. And he says that's a ridiculous system of economics, because the government tells you what to buy, what not to buy. The government tells this industry they can build their things and those industries cannot. How can the government possibly know what the people want? It leads to an unbalanced and inefficient economy. So what does Adam Smith argue for? What the hell is it? Complete freedom in the marketplace. Everybody buys and sells what they want. Everybody builds and trades what they want. Well, then what rules determine the marketplace? Simple. Supply, demand. The people want, somebody supplies. Whoever supplies the best product stays in business. Those that produce crappy products go out of business and build something else. Everybody benefits. Good products at cheap prices for the consumer. And lots of jobs for the expanding successful markets. What about the people that go out of business? Well, they'll go and build other industries. Okay. So complete freedom of manufacturing choices in the country and complete freedom worldwide of trade. Open borders. That's laissez-faire. The government leaves it alone. Yes.
So this is all happening in Europe, correct?
This is all happening in Europe.
And everything in you, well, what?
This is in Western Europe. Mostly France, a couple of Englishmen, a couple of Germans, and an Italian.
Nice.
My man. Go. Well, capitalism and laissez-faire are part and parcel of the same thing. There's a capitalism where the government doesn't interfere with it, and it's purely supply and demand. And then there's what we have today, which is the government does interfere in the economy. How? We allow unions. We have minimum wage. We have overtime for workers. All of these things take profit out of the pocket of the employer. Why? For the benefit of society in general.
You say it like it's a bad thing.
No, I'm saying it in a factual, matter-of-fact way. I love regulated capitalism.
Yeah, otherwise you get like, you ever heard of a game called Bioshock?
Not yet.
Okay, it's like based on Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism, pretty much like the whole society they focus on like complete laissez-faire capitalism.
Yeah.
So in the end, you kind of like, yeah, it starts out good. The city underwater, it's pretty much based on the city underwater, which is based on that form of economics. But eventually, yeah, things turn out bad. Like when you have like, I don't know, like mechanical men and just like giant mutants and like these, I don't know. It's like
No order, chaos, and a whole lot of people suffering.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Now, let's talk about criminal justice. There was a time back in this period, the 1700s, where while some people were asking about economics, some people were talking about politics, some people were talking about organized religion, Cesare Beccaria, an Italian, frumpy-looking Italian, I'll admit, said, what is wrong with our criminal justice system? Well, I'll tell you. Currently in our criminal justice system, we emphasize punishment. We believe criminals are forever evil, and they cannot be reformed. We believe that you should just throw them in prison, even for minor prison sentences, because if you're a criminal, you must be evil and you can't be fixed. Remember this idea of original sin, that if you commit a crime, then that original sin must have, that idea that humans are naturally prone to sin is bigger in criminals. The current criminal justice system also depended on the death penalty and torture. Because if you can't reform a criminal, and you haven't got space in your jails, kill him. Finally, the current criminal justice system is simply corrupt. Not all the laws are published. And if you break a law, you wouldn't even know. And if you did get arrested, and you didn't have enough money to bribe your judge or whatever, you would get less punishment, you would get more punishment than the wealthy. So, none of the criminal justice system acts as a deterrent, because if you're going to be arrested for any crime, minor or major, and get the same penalty, either many years in prison or the death penalty, then there's really no reason for you not to commit a worse crime. If you're going to get the death penalty for stealing 1 cow or 5 cows, then just try for 5. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
The death penalty, if you're going to get the death penalty regardless, it's just like, that's the ultimate punishment. Screw it. Whatever I do is going to happen, so let it happen. So Beccaria came out and he said, if we really want to reform the criminal justice system, if we want to convince people not to commit crimes, we have to have some efficiency, some order, some common sense. For instance, the punishment has to fit the crime. Meaning, you steal 1 cow, you go to jail for a year. You steal 5 cows, you go to jail for 5 years. The assumption is criminals are rational. More crime, more punishment, so I'm going to commit less crime. If I'm going to commit a crime anyway because I'm hungry, I'll commit less of a crime. Secondly, the death penalty. Get rid of it. It doesn't serve any purpose but to make us feel better that we're punishing someone. It doesn't serve any purpose. But if you put people in jail for the rest of their lives, that's going to scare the hell out of them. Because death is over in a second. Cut the head off, no pain, you're done. But 30 years in prison, that focuses your attention on not committing that crime. And finally, publish all the laws and apply them equally so that everybody knows that everybody will be treated the same, regardless of wealth or social standing, so that everybody respects the law and everybody is afraid of breaking the law, because punishment will be swift and consistent. So the whole humans are rational, trust them, applies to the criminal justice system, that even criminals are rational. Except for like the clearly deranged. But most criminals are not. Most criminals commit minor crimes for need, hunger, etc. And these ideas were broadly adopted in the criminal justice systems across the planet. So, we've done foundation of strong central government, done checks and balances, we've done the scientific revolution, industrial revolution, we've done the Enlightenment. All of this means there's this greater desire, especially in the Enlightenment, that the people have rights. Government must respond to the rights of the people. It also means governments, societies are becoming more complex. You have these growing groups of people that want to say in politics, and governments that want to maintain order. What happens when all of these ideas are put into practice? And that's what happens next. We look at what the ideas of the Enlightenment mean in practice. The American Revolution, the French Revolution, and what happens after that. All right? Any questions? All right. Have a good weekend. I'll see you next Wednesday, because Monday, holiday, next Wednesday papers due. First draft. Everyone does the draft, not voluntary. Everybody does a draft. Remember the checklist.